Welcome back to the first lecture in period 3. This lecture is meant to give you all of the background information or the context for everything that's going to happen in this period that will include the French and Indian War, the American War for Independence, and the early Republic. The learning objective is explain the context in which America gained independence and developed a sense of national identity. And to begin with the first key concept, is British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. So the end of salutary neglect, which was Britain ignoring its colonies and leaving them to manage themselves, is over due to the French and Indian War. So due to these wars being fought in North America, they were looking to replenish their treasuries from all the expenses that they had to spend on the war, and they're looking for tax revenue. The rise of the independent movement is going to be due to the imperial taxes that Britain lays on the colonies, who have, for this time period, have already built a tradition of self-government, and so they are angry that they are having taxes placed on them that they had no say in passing. The colonists are vying for independence when the direct representation that they were asking for in Parliament is denied. On the right side here, you see a picture of Patrick Henry making his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in the Virginia House of Burgesses. And then the example of the stamps that the stamp tax was going to require colonists to have on all of their documents. So to begin with the 7 Years' War, the competition among the British, French, and American Indians for economic and political advantage in North America culminated in the 7 Years' War. In North America, it's sometimes called the French and Indian War, in which Britain defeated France and allied American Indians. So the cause began as a territorial dispute in the Ohio River Valley. George Washington, who was a young lieutenant in the Virginia Regiment or militia, was sent out to this Ohio River Valley near present-day Pittsburgh to tell the French to stop building their forts there and to leave. So that's what causes the war to begin. Eventually, there's going to be a British victory despite a slow start by the British. Their strategy takes them through French Canada, and they capture Quebec, Montreal, and it leads to the French surrender. So desire for self-government here, colonists wanted to assert the ideals of self-government in the face of renewed British imperial efforts led to a colonial independence movement and war with Britain. So this is after the French and Indian War is over, and once the British have started to impose those imperial taxes on the colonies to pay for the war debts. So the series of taxes passed to repay for the war expenses. The Stamp Act of 1765 was one of the first of many later taxes that are meant to repay for the war. And in 1763, the British set the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is going to keep colonists from moving further out west to prevent wars with Native Americans in that territory. That's going to make the colonists really angry since they had just fought a war to expel the French from that territory. Colonists resist these taxes and resist the Proclamation Line of 1763 at first with some success. So they will get the Stamp Act of 1765 repealed through boycotts and petitions, but later on the Crown and Parliament are not going to be as accepting of these boycotts. Democratic and Republican ideals here. So the American Revolution's democratic and Republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. The first type of government that is established here is a republic, and that is set through the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1783, just a couple months before the American victory. Later on in 1789, the US Constitution is going to be adopted to fix all of the problems that came from the Articles of Confederation. There were some difficulties and inefficiencies. At the same time, the states or the colonies were instructed to write their own state constitutions to have a form of government that was now separate from the monarchy. So each state wrote their own constitution, and here's the seal of the state of Virginia. You can see their motto is Sic Semper Tyrannis, and it's a visual of Caesar being slain. So all of these states are going to have differences in their state governments, but they're all going to be representative or Republican in a way. Next key concept says the ideals that inspired the revolutionary cause reflected new beliefs about politics, religion, and society that had been developing over the course of the 18th century. So here we're going to see that everything that came out of the revolution was really just a reflection of everything that had been going on before it. So in terms of politics, the ideals for self-government, Enlightenment ideas of the social contract, that was best articulated in Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet, which said that the colonies, by virtue of being bigger and having more resources, should not have to be owned and managed by a small island in Europe. In terms of religion, we saw that the Great Awakening led to more Protestant sects, which led to a call for separation of church and state. And that was also seen in these new state constitutions, which provided for those same liberties. And then the political developments that kept women having no rights to vote and continued to ensure that slaves or enslaved people were seen as property. That was also written into these new forms of government. And so here's another example of how the things that were going on in society prior to the revolution are being reflected by the products, which are these state constitutions and the national form of government. Next key concept here says, after declaring independence, American political leaders created new constitutions and Declaration of Rights that articulated the role of the state and federal governments while protecting individual liberties and limiting both centralized power and excessive popular influence. So this is to say that the colonists were rejecting strong centralized power. They were leaving a monarchy with a parliament that they saw as tyrannical. And so therefore, they overcorrected the other way. They wanted a very decentralized form of government. So that's where the Articles of Confederation got most of its structure. And in the state constitutions, we also see this idea of separation of powers, which had been developed by the Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu. So you see his picture right there. You have different branches of government, and by splitting up power amongst those branches, you are rejecting tyranny, you are rejecting a monarchy, and you're keeping power separated so that no one can abuse it. And then in terms of protecting individual liberties, these state constitutions that were ratified by each state sometimes had a Bill of Rights that came as a preface to the Constitution, or sometimes they were bills or laws that were written after the fact, after the constitutions were adopted. One of the most famous ones is Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. It was something that he was so proud of that he actually put it as part of his tombstone. There are only three things that he wanted to be remembered for. That was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedoms, and the founding of the University of Virginia. Next key concept here is new forms of national culture and political institutions developed in the United States alongside continued regional variations and differences over economic, political, social, and foreign policy issues. So now we're getting into the time period of the early republic. Now Washington is president, and he's going to be followed by John Adams. And the new national culture is developing that is centered on having defeated the British. The loyalists, who were also colonists, who were supporting Britain, most of them left at the end of the revolution. And so this new American culture was based on their antagonism to centralized power. There were regional differences that developed amongst the new states, and there were economic and social issues that led to these differences. In the North, they began to pass laws that were going to phase out slavery, while in the South, those laws continued to protect slavery and will continue to allow for the importation of enslaved people until 1807, when a federal law is passed banning the importation of enslaved people. We have two new political parties that developed during this time, the Federalists that are led by Alexander Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans that are led by Thomas Jefferson. Next key concept here says migration within North America and competition over resources, boundaries, and trade intensified conflicts among peoples and nations. So the migrations that happened after the American independence deals with people moving into the Trans-Appalachian Territory, into what we know now as the Midwest. So these Americans are moving west to occupy the land that had been previously been denied to them by the British. Under the Articles of Confederation, they organized the Northwest Territory under the Northwest Ordinance. And so it was going to determine how people were going to be able to purchase this land and then later settle on it. There are still other European powers in North America at this time that will lead to disputes. So the Spanish are still in North America, in the Louisiana Territory and in Florida, and then the British are still in Canada. So there are still going to be disputes between these European powers. So in the decades after American independence, these interactions among different groups resulted in competition for resources and shifting alliances and cultural blendings. So the three groups with which the United States has disputes with are Native Americans, the British, and the Spanish. And in terms of the Native Americans, the United States continued to fight wars in the Northwest, and it finally culminated with an American victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near the Ohio River. That was later settled by the Treaty of Greenville, and it gave Native Americans some territory in the far northwest so that American settlers could then occupy the territory that was being vacated by them. The treaty that was signed and adopted to define the borders with Spanish Florida was Pinckney's Treaty. It gave the United States navigation rights along the Mississippi River. So all of those new settlers that were settling down along the Ohio River Valley could use the Ohio River that then connects to the Mississippi River to send their goods and their crops downstream to be exported through the city of New Orleans. And then finally, Jay's Treaty was with the British, and it was supposed to tie up some loose ends from the Revolution. They wanted to remove the British troops who were still stationed out in the Northwest and to reestablish their trade relationship. The treaty was mostly written by Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who was the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, had been sent out to negotiate it. And because it reestablished this friendly relationship between the United States and the Great Britain, the French, who were American allies, were really angered by this. And the Democratic Republicans, who wanted a closer relationship with the French, were also greatly angered by this. So the continued presence of European powers in North America challenged the United States to find ways to safeguard its borders, maintain neutral trading rights, and promote its economic interests. So we continue to want to safeguard our borders by keeping the British out of North America. So from 1783, the end of the Revolutionary War, to 1795, there were still British troops in the Western territories of the United States. We negotiated for them leaving in Jay's Treaty in 1794, but even after Jay's Treaty, not many of them were left, and they will continue to be a problem through the next historical period, and they will become an issue in the War of 1812. In terms of maintaining neutrality and promoting our economic interests, we are still wanting to keep friendly alliances with other European powers that are going to be trading partners. And this becomes a problem during the Adams presidency with the XYZ affair. So some American diplomats go over to France, and they are treated poorly. They're asked for a bribe in order to be able to go ahead and do their job and meet with the French ambassadors or the French ministers. And so they come back, and the political cartoon that you see on the bottom right is a British cartoon that shows the French harassing the United States that is portrayed as Columbia. It's the lady it's second to the left, that she's being grabbed and manhandled, and she's having all her riches taken away from her. All right, to recap, the 7 Years' War was fought over territory in North America against the British. The British debt from the war led to a more active administration over the colonies, which included taxes. The colonists' experience with self-government led to an independence movement as a rejection of those British policies and taxes. During the war, we adopt the Articles of Confederation and state constitutions, and they embody Republican and democratic ideals. And then finally, the conflicts with natives and European powers into the early republic are going to continue to be a problem. All right, that is it for this first lecture in period 3. I will see you again for the second lecture in period 3, in which we talk more deeply about the French and Indian War. I'll see you then.